The winner of the game is the player who makes the next to last mistake. The mistakes are there, waiting to be made. No one ever won a game by resigning. It is always better to sacrifice your opponent's men. And my personal favorite, a chess game is divided into 3 stages. The first, when you hope you have an advantage. The second, when you believe you have an advantage. And the third, when you know you're going to lose. This particular quote perfectly encapsulates my blitz chess games. Now, all of these quotes come from the mind of the great Savielly Tartakower, one of the most quoted chess authors of all time. Both a great chess author and a great chess player, our number 2 best chess game of the 1920s is his spectacular victory over Maroczy from 1922. Maroczy opens the game here with pawn to d4, and Tartakower responds with pawn to e6, offering the option of both the Dutch and the French. Now, we've already seen him use this particular move against Capablanca in a game that was played 2 years after this game. Of course, against Capablanca, he didn't have quite the same success, but he still had a good opening. In this game, he's going to have good opening success and good success in the finish as well. After pawn to e6, we see c4 and f5. In neither game did White take the option to play against a French defense, which I think a modern grandmaster would be eager to do. Of course, choosing between playing against the French defense and the Dutch defense might be quite a challenge, as both are considered pretty good options for White. But after pawn to d4, e6, Black could have gone for something like a Nimzo-Indian, which is considered a better option than either the Dutch or the French. In either case, these are all exciting openings, and at least at an amateur level, you can play all of these. Knight c3, knight f6, and here we see some inaccuracies from both players, but of course we only understand these moves to be inaccuracies because we now have Stockfish and we stand on the shoulder of these giants. So a3, obviously designed to stop bishop b4, which isn't a move that White is really taking a tempo to stop these days. But okay, pawn to a3, certainly not a big mistake, and bishop to e7. Given that Black is going to play a stonewall, which he might not have been committed to, at least mentally yet in this position, but given that Black plays a stonewall, the bishop would rather go to d6. Not right away, but Black can go for a stonewall in this position. Instead of playing bishop e7, you can play d5 or prepare that move, and then put the bishop on d6, which would have saved a tempo on getting to the same positions later in this particular game. Of course, we are going to have a closed position, so the loss of a small tempo for either player isn't a huge factor in the result of the game. Now, we get pawn to e3. Modern players would almost always go for pawn to g3 and the fianchetto. That's considered very good against the Dutch. Castles, bishop to d3, and d5, committing to the stonewall, where again, this bishop would rather be over here. Knight to f3, pawn to c6, castles, knight to e4. The knight is, of course, beautiful on e4. What Black has to watch out for is at some point that knight getting evicted, because a knight on e5 for White can never be evicted, but a knight on e4 for Black can be. In this case, that's not going to happen, though. So, queen to c2, bishop to d6, the bishop finds the right diagonal, an excellent diagonal, and pawn to b3, knight to d7. Full of confidence in the scientific basis of his play, White treats the game from a purely positional point of view, whereas Black regards the given position as a vast problem. Mate in 25 moves. Having said that, Tartakower now goes for that checkmate in 25 moves to which he aspires. Rook to f6. Those who play or are interested in playing the stonewall should really take note of this particular maneuver. Note that the knight didn't go to f6 yet because it would get in the way of the rook. It's a very natural move, but Tartakower's play here with rook f6, intending for the rook obviously to go to h6, is very, very dangerous and obviously creates more immediate and direct threats. For example, in this position and many upcoming positions, if you play a natural move like knight to d2, trying to pull the knight back, evict the knight on e4, make some exchanges that will allow you to get A very, very good position. Keep in mind, if some pieces leave the board, the badness of this bishop, the difficulty of developing this rook will give white a very large advantage. In this position, black just wins. Bishop takes h2 check. The knight can't really leave f3, which makes it hard for white to achieve the things that white would aspire to. After bishop takes h2 check here, a very strong move, if you take, then you have rook to h6 check. And now if you fall back king g1, which is actually forced because the knight covers g3, simply queen h4, and the queen is coming into h2 or h1 with checkmate. Now, of course, Maroczy is a great master, and he's not going to allow something like this, but the lingering threat of this bishop takes h2 idea is difficult to deal with, and he doesn't really deal with it very well in the game. After rook f6, he plays rook f to e1, which doesn't really do anything in the position. He's drifting a little bit, unsure, I think, about how to deal with this strong knight here on e4. So rook to h6, amping up the threats. And in this position, and note that by now we have immediate ideas of bishop takes h2. For example, b4, a natural move that doesn't really do anything. Boom, bishop takes h2, and it doesn't even matter that the knight is defending the h2 square, because after knight takes h2, queen h4, the knight is just lost. If it moves, there's mate down here on h1. So these problems are really, really hard to deal with. After rook h6, we see g3 from Maroczy. Of course, if he had played this earlier, something we now know that now that we have a century more of Dutch experience, and brought the bishop around here, his position would have been much stronger. But after g3, trying to blunt this diagonal, we see queen to f6. The queen's coming over, trying to get in on the action. And now, again, you might be thinking, okay, I've blunted this bishop. Maybe I can finally move my knight here and resolve the pressure in the position. But unfortunately not. If knight d2, there's another blow. Knight takes f2 in this position, and this again wins for black. After king takes, rook takes h2 check. You already have 2 pawns for the knight, and after king g1, bishop takes g3, you have a 3rd pawn. Of course, the white king is never surviving with no protection in this position, and queen h4 is coming, and this is negative a whole lot in this position. So, unable to do that, we see Maroczy try bishop f1, which makes a lot of sense. The bishop is coming around here, which seems like an excellent place for the bishop. But boom, g5. We're intending simply to play g4 and evict this knight. Rook a to d1, another move that doesn't really accomplish anything. g4, the knight should move. And in this position, instead of moving the knight, and again, if knight back to d2, which is the most natural move in this position, we have knight takes f2, rook takes, bishop takes g3, an idea we've already seen, and it is decisive for black. So in this position, Maroczy tries to simplify the position. Knight takes e4. At least one piece can be eliminated, so there will no longer be a knight sacrifice on f2 after the knight moves off of the attacked f3 square. But pawn takes e4, which opens the f-file, and now the knight goes to d2. In this position, Tartakower comments, if one casts a glance over the board, it will be observed that, at the moment, the white king has as its only real defense the bishop on f1, whereas all the other pieces are mere units, or even simple spectators, but that, on the other hand, the entire black queen's wing is in an embryonic state of development. The question that presents itself to black is, therefore, the following: prepare or pillage? And in this position, Tartakower goes for the spectacular move, rook takes h2. An absolutely brilliant sacrifice. I think one of the best sacrifices that has been played in chess history. Now, there's a lot to say about this particular sacrifice, and I really want to let Tartakower say it, but one thing I want to comment on here is that about even 20 years ago or less than that, chess engines who are already very strong couldn't appreciate the strength of this sacrifice. I really enjoyed a passage in John Nunn's Secrets of Practical Chess where he talks about taking this position right here and running it through a computer tournament because the computers thought that black should not go for this sacrifice. But after they played a tournament, black won almost all games, which at the time indicated that computers couldn't look deeply enough in many positions to appreciate the strength of some sacrifices. But being computers, if they played it out and played pretty perfectly, they would eventually reach the right evaluation, which is winning for black. Now, Tartakower comments in his notes to this game, this sacrifice of a major piece without immediate striking consequences exacted the most elaborate calculation. Positively, black has to foresee if he would succeed in carrying out certain essential quiet moves, such as knight to f6 to h5 and then on to g3, as well as bishop to d7, before the adversary can throw his rescue troops into the fight. Negatively, black had to work out that a slow and methodical reinforcement of his attack would also allow his opponent to consolidate. There was some debate after the game about whether this move, as Tartakower describes it, was calculation or really intuition. I think most players would look to a move like this as being one based on intuition because there are so many variations that it's very, very hard to calculate. But Tartakower saw this as a problem of calculation, and it was his game, so who can question really what he was able to calculate and not calculate in the position? After rook takes h2, of course, white must accept the rook sacrifice. King takes h2. If you were to try, instead of king takes h2, throwing in a counter sacrifice here, like knight takes e4 so that the queen can defend the f2 square, then here you don't take the knight. Instead, you play queen h6, the knight remains hanging, now the rook is defended, and there are threats of mate with rook to h1. So, we do get king takes on h2, and then queen takes f2 check. Of course, one part of this sacrifice is a decoy pulling the king to the h2 square and away from the f2 pawn. So that pawn is picked up, and now the g3 pawn will fall as well, in good time. The king moves back to h1, and in this position you can capture on g3, but that's not the strongest. Instead, knight to f6, a better move bringing up reinforcements. Tartakower at this point says, the first point of the sacrifice, since white's whole second rank of pieces remains paralyzed, black has just sufficient time to bring his reserve troops into action. Weak would be the plausible capture on g3 because of knight to b1, immediately allowing the queen to come to the aid of the king. So, after knight to f6, Tartakower is maintaining the pin on the second rank. That prevents any line where the queen can come over and offer a queen trade, which would be difficult for black to deal with while keeping the initiative. So, instead, the rook is going to step up to the second rank with rook to e2, but this isn't as effective because the queen would control more squares and have more ideas of pushing back the black queen that doesn't want a queen trade. So after rook e2, we now have queen takes g3. This is maybe a good moment to pause and evaluate the position because after the rook sacrifice on h2, you can at least see, if not this exact position coming up, a position where black has 3 pawns for the sacrificed rook. Now, the reason that many players find this particular sacrifice so surprising is that black is going for this sacrifice with a queen, a bishop, a knight, which doesn't necessarily seem that involved at the moment, and a bishop on c8 and a rook on a8 that are not involved. And it seems like all of these pieces should be able to come over, defend the king, and push black back. But it doesn't turn out to actually be true. This is a situation where the quality of black's pieces, the quality that is going to improve with moves like queen h4, bishop to g3, knight to h5, maybe even pawn g3, etc., is much, much more important than quantity and even than reinforcements. There's enough time to bring up reinforcements because black's pieces are so powerful that they tie white down and really prevent white from marshaling good defense here. So after queen takes g3, we see knight b1. Now the queen has some defensive capability along the second rank, but the knight feels even more out of the action. Knight to h5, queen to d2, bishop to d7. It's certainly a slow maneuver if this bishop is going to be involved. Hint, it will be, but it's rapidly involving the rook. Rook to f2, queen to h4, king g1, and bishop to g3. This bishop g3 move is very, very strong. And basically at this point, black is already regaining some material because there's no way for this rook to avoid capture by the bishop. For example, rook g2 is simply met by rook f8, bringing up more reinforcements, and there's no really good way to meet invasion here by the black pieces. Also note that e5 is coming at some point and this bishop is coming in. So this is just a position in which white is pretty much unable to move. So after bishop g3, at this point, Maroczy is very, very eager to give back some material to break the attack. He plays bishop c3. We do get bishop captures on f2, and I think the reason to capture isn't even so much the capture of the rook and the fact that you're regaining a little bit of material. It's more that the bishop was in the pawn's way, and so after queen takes, now g3, the pawn has advanced. The pawn is very strong. Black gains ideas of bringing the rook around to f2. Black gains ideas of bringing the queen to h2. And now after pawn to e5, this bishop can potentially come in to maybe h3 or to g4 and then f3. Basically, black's pieces have rapid inroads in the position and there's no good way for white to deal with it. The attacked queen moves to g2 and rook f8. Tartakower commented, "At length, it can be said that black's development is more or less complete. The threat is rook to f2, queen to h1, and then rook to h2, trapping the queen." This is a very nice line that illustrates how helpless white's pieces basically are in this position. And the idea of trapping the queen on h1 I find pretty funny. So after rook f8, we now see bishop back to e1. The bishop is trying to keep the rook out of f2. But in this position, Tartakower finds a really, really nice continuation of the attack. Now, he didn't need to play in the way that he's going to. There are many good lines. But if you want to try to find the way that he did play, pause your video here. So Tartakower went for rook takes f1 check. A really brilliant move. Now, Stockfish may say that other lines, such as the patient queen g5, are at least as good or even better. But rook takes f1 is direct and forcing, and it is winning. And who can resist a nice sacrifice like this when it is decisive? And it unleashes all of your pieces. Tartakower commented, "The second assault. It is a question of gaining sufficient time by this fresh sacrifice to bring his bishop, hitherto inactive, into the thick of the fight." This forcing sacrifice, of course, must be accepted either by the capture with the queen, which is particularly unappealing because of the immediate mate with queen to h2, or by the king. After king takes on f1, the king and the queen are now in an awkward alignment. So after pawn to e5, this pretty move unleashes the bishop, and there's the immediate threat of bishop to h3, which will pin and win the queen on g2. This is basically the justification of the sacrifice of the rook. It's that this tempo to bring the bishop in is more important than the rook. Now, after pawn to e5, we see king over to g1, stepping out of the way of the pin. The bishop comes to g4 instead, and this bishop is simply going to go to f3, which is a huge square. There's no way for white to avoid significant loss of material here. After bishop takes g3, which was basically forced, if not on this turn, then on the next turn, we have knight takes g3, and now black is equal in material. After all the sacrifices, material is equal. But of course, in this position, black's pieces are just dominating. Material count is not what matters. What matters is the safety of the king, the idea of bishop to f3, and also the immediate attack on the rook on d1. We get rook to e1 here, and now knight to f5. The knight is beautifully positioned here. There are many choices that are winning for Tartakower though. Queen to f2, queen to g5, pawn takes on e5, bishop to f3 with discovered check, king to f1, and knight to g3 check. After knight to g3 check, Maroczy resigned in this position. Of course, king to g1 is forced, and after king g1, you have, well, really many excellent moves, but simplest, cleanest, most decisive is knight to h1, sticking the knight in the corner, creating a discovered check on the king, and winning the queen on h2. A very, very beautiful game and a beautiful final position. Tartakower noted at the end that the judges awarded this game the third Brilliancy Prize, although the majority of them declared in peremptory fashion that such sacrifices are incalculable in all their ramifications in advance, and that, in consequence, they deserve no encouragement. Of course, I and basically all chess players disagree. We love this game. We love the sacrifice, the intuition, and the calculation. This game is a classic for many reasons, including the demonstration of the importance of king safety and piece quality over material. I hope that you've enjoyed this game exactly as much as I have. I hope it inspires you to win some sacrificial games of your own. If you want to see more of my best chess games of the 1920s, simply click on that playlist that is popping up on your screen.